Good afternoon and welcome to World Oregon's webinar. Today is May 13th. We're excited to be hosting a invigorating conversation called Wheatfields to the World, Oregon, Hunger, and Humanitarian Aid. We have a stellar group of panelists today for a program that is presented as part of the Engage America World Food Program USA Speaker Series, which is supported by the World Affairs Councils of America, of which World Oregon is a member, World Food Program USA, and additional sponsorship from the MJ Murdoch Charitable Trust. And a special welcome to friends of the trust who are joining us today through their outreach. As you know, the U.S. has been a leader in support for international food security programs and a key part of the formation of the United Nations World Food Program, which is very notably awarded in 2020 the Nobel Peace Prize and is the largest hunger relief humanitarian organization. We're going to dive into what this means today, the legacy of food aid, anti-hunger advocacy, and really connecting the role of U.S. agriculture, particularly in this case, Oregon's wheat industry, in helping to combat both domestic and global hunger. I would note this is a really important topic that World Oregon has been tackling a lot recently. Some of you may have joined us for the last speaker in our international speaker series, Tom Colicchio, a famed restaurateur and lead judge on Top Chef, who spoke extensively about combating hunger. And later we'll post in the chat the link to watch that talk on YouTube should you have missed it. Today we have three distinguished panelists who are going to enlighten us and really get a good discussion, and we look forward to your questions. Those are Rebecca Middleton, who's the Chief Advocacy and Engagement Officer with World Food Program USA. Amanda Hoey, who is the CEO of the Oregon Wheat Growers Commission and Oregon Wheat Growers League. And Jeremy Everett, the founder and executive director of the Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty at Baylor University. And it should be really a rich, engaging discussion about both global and domestic food insecurity and Oregon's contributions to aid hunger relief in the global food supply. As a reminder, this is being recorded for later posting on YouTube. Everyone who has their video and audio on is a panelist. Those of you in the audience can pose your questions in the Q&A function, please. And we will post in the chat links to programs and shows that are mentioned during the discussion. And without further ado, let's dive into the program. I'm going to ask Rebecca to join us on screen, who will be kicking off the discussion. And again, we're thrilled to be partnering on this important topic. Thanks so much. And Rebecca, the floor is yours. Oh, and Rebecca, I apologize that your audio is not working.
Oh, thank you very much. Glad we tested it. So I was saying, I just thank you, Derek, and good afternoon. And thank you everyone for having me here with you today. As Derek mentioned, I'm the Chief Advocacy and Engagement Officer at the World Food Program USA, and we're located in Washington, D.C. So some of you may have heard of us, but I'm sure some of you haven't. So let me start with a basic overview of the UN World Food Program and the World Food Program USA and how we work together. So the United Nations World Food Program is the world's largest humanitarian organization. Last year, they reached over 100 million people in 83 countries, and this year they're ramping up to reach over 138 million in those same countries. That's meeting the rising need driven by COVID-19, unfortunately. Now, how does WFP do this? They have an incredible and sophisticated logistics network. On any given day, they have over 5,600 trucks, 30 ships, and nearly 100 planes on the move, supported by 20,000 folks across the world, delivering aid and other assistance to those most in need. 2/3 of their work is in conflict-affected countries where people are 3 times more likely to be undernourished than those living in countries without conflict. So where does WFP USA fit into all of this? So we are the 501c3 based in the US that works with policymakers, corporations, foundations, and individuals to generate the financial and in-kind resources to support the World Food Program's work and to develop policies necessary to alleviate hunger. So let's start by talking a little bit about the scope of hunger on a global level. So what is hunger? How do we define that in the global sense? And I'm sure Jeremy will talk a little bit about the domestic side and how we define it at home. But across the world, hunger is considered the lack of consistent access to enough nutritious food. And acute hunger happens when people have large gaps in their nutritional needs and or have to take drastic steps to meet those needs. So across the world, hunger is growing. It is female. It's historically rural, but increasingly urban, and it affects children and refugees disproportionately. Sadly, after a decade of decline, the number of hungry people around the world has increased in recent years. And this year, COVID-19 is unfortunately causing it to skyrocket. So just to put it in perspective, 5 years ago, there were approximately 80 million people facing severe hunger, meaning they were on the brink of starvation and relied on life-saving food assistance daily to survive. Last year, 2020, that number was 149 million. And by the end of this year, that number is expected to rise to 270 million, mostly because of the socioeconomic impacts of COVID-19. Nearly half the world's hungry, believe it or not, are small-scale farmers, people who grow just enough, but often not quite enough food to meet the needs for themselves and their families. There are a number of reasons why hunger is getting worse, but mainly it's due to the pandemic and also to the increase in man-made conflict. So now that I've told you the bad news, I want to share the good news about the US's rich bipartisan history of providing international food aid and assistance that dates back to the earliest years of our nation. Under the leadership of our fourth president, James Madison, this is the first known instance where we provided international food aid. In 1812, the US sent what at the time was $50,000 worth of wheat to Venezuela after a devastating earthquake. Since that first contribution, the United States has time and again asserted itself as a global food security leader, including food and assistance programs for Europe after World War I and World War II, the establishment of the Federal Office for Food for Peace in the 1950s, and the work of Senator George McGovern under President Kennedy to bring the idea of the World Food Program to the UN General Assembly in 1961. So quite a legacy. And this legacy of nonpartisan support for US global food assistance continues today. I'm pleased to say that the new USAID administrator, Samantha Power, was formerly the US ambassador to the United Nations in the Obama administration. She understands WFP's work extremely well. And on her very first day after she had been sworn in, she had a call with World Food Program Executive Director David Beasley to discuss the growing food security needs around the world. Today, the United States is the UN World Food Program's largest funder, providing roughly 40% of all contributions in any given year. It's also the largest provider of commodity assistance, taking the productivity of American farms and putting it into life-saving food assistance through the Title II Food for Peace program and the McGovern Dual School Feeding Program. Sometimes people say, why don't we just send cash? But we do provide cash assistance to the World Food Program, which is used for cash-based transfers and where there are commodities available for in-country and regional purchase. But many places the World Food Program works do not have food available due to conflict or lack of markets. So there remains a significant need for commodity assistance in this portfolio. Our American commodity-based food aid programs are funded at approximately $2 billion a year, including through the programs I mentioned earlier. Depending on market prices, that translates to somewhere between 1.5 to 2 million metric tons of US commodities in a given year. Those purchases impact economies throughout the United States. So for example, in 2019, $1.97 billion worth of commodities for international food aid were purchased from approximately 20 states, and that funded the procurement of more than 1.65 million metric tons of food. To put this in human terms, over the course of the last 70 years since the Office of Food for Peace was established, American generosity to those in need for food around the world has reached more than 4 billion people. Think about it. I had to double check that, but yes, 4 billion people. And Oregon plays a huge role in this work. So every year, Oregon farmers grow about 75 million bushels of mostly soft white wheat. And between 85 and 90% of that is shipped overseas, sold for commercial purposes, or used for humanitarian assistance. Just a few years ago, USAID bought more than 300,000 metric tons of wheat, lentils, and peas from the state. And I wanted to finish up with a story many of you are probably familiar with, but I didn't want to go without mentioning. But in 2018, 7 ships left the port of Portland for a 40-day journey of more than 11,000 nautical miles to bring 176 metric tons of wheat purchased from farmers in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest to millions of vulnerable people in Yemen. The UN World Food Program helped to distribute this wheat to feed more than 7 million people for 2 whole months. It was an amazing act of humanitarianism, and the impact was felt thousands of miles away. I think this also provides the perfect transition to our next panelist, Amanda Hoey. Amanda?
Great. Well, thank you, Rebecca. Yes, that is a great segue into the work that Oregon Wheat does in feeding the world. So I am Amanda Hoey, the CEO for Oregon Wheat, and I represent about 2,000 growers that are producing wheat on roughly 720,000 acres in the state of Oregon. So in total, the wheat that's grown in Oregon equates to about 1.26 million metric tons produced annually. And to put that into context, that's the equivalent of the grain that's needed for almost 2 billion loaves of bread. So as you look at the wheat fields across our beautiful state, including those behind me, imagine those as 2 billion loaves of bread. So while that sounds like a lot, at least to me, we are not the largest wheat producing state by a long shot, and our production is well eclipsed by other sections of the US. But we are producing a grain and a class of wheat that is exceedingly well adapted to our climatic conditions and is useful in both domestic and international consumption. And it plays a very important role in humanitarian aid. So going back to that statement, farmers feed the world, it's one that we have used very often because it's really what we're doing. We're producing grain that is an essential dietary staple around the world. But as in any industry, particularly in wheat, periodically we take a step back to look at the message. And in 2014, there was a study that was conducted by the Center for Food Integrity, which brought into question if this message still resonated. And the research study noted that only 25% of people believed that the US held responsibility for addressing food insecurity in the rest of the world, and noted a focus on their own access to healthy and affordable food had increased in prominence. So then that brought the question, do our consumers really no longer care about the ability of our farms to feed the world? And as I considered it, I really don't think that's the case, although sometimes there's a disconnect between the consumer and the producer as to what it takes to grow that food. We are really caring human beings. So I think what we're facing is a yes and statement. Yes, it is absolutely accurate that there's been increased attention on how our food is grown, which is also driving a significant portion of policy conversations. And our consumers really do care about the role that we play in addressing food insecurity, both domestically and abroad. So I'll start with that yes statement on the basic understanding of how our food is grown, particularly Oregon wheat, and what it's used for to really appreciate it. So most of the wheat that's grown in Oregon is classified as winter wheat. And what that means is that our seeds that are planted in the fall, the plants go into dormancy during the winter, and then they're harvested for grain in the following summer. So for our farmers, what they planted in August through October for that winter wheat, they won't harvest until July through August of the next year. And if we add on top of that for our dryland areas, the low rainfall zones, due to soil moisture factors, in a number of cases, every other year the land rests and is fallow, which means it's not planted. So on a piece of ground, a farmer is tending to that land for 2 full years for each crop that it grows, which represents a lot of patience, a lot of risk, and a lot of work, frankly, a lot of factors that are outside of a producer's control. But that growing season, the winter or spring, is only one of the elements that determines the class of wheat. The other 2 are hardness and color. So in total, there are 6 classes of wheat, each with different end-use preferences. And then within those classes, there are hundreds of varieties. So each individual farmer is making planting decisions in relation to the variety and class based on what will perform best in their environment and for their market. And of the 6 classes of wheat, soft white winter wheat dominates our plantings in Oregon. Really, given the growing conditions, it's just really well suited for our area, and overall the Pacific Northwest states produce the vast majority of US soft white wheat. So this class of wheat in particular, it has low protein, low water absorption, some weak gluten characteristics, and produces high yields, which a combination of those factors create excellent, high quality flour milling results that is valued for products like cakes, pastries, Asian style noodles, and is ideally suited to flatbread. So the use then factors into the primary customer interest. So thus far, this market year, our market years go through May, the primary market destination for Oregon and Pacific Northwest soft white wheat are the Philippines, China, Korea, Japan, and Indonesia, followed really closely by Yemen due to the volume of humanitarian food aid that's provided. So historically, wheat has really played a very large part in food aid. It, as Rebecca noted, was one of the first commodities sent overseas as part of food aid programs. And specifically in Food for Peace funding, wheat has consistently represented the top 3 commodities. So Oregon wheat producers really have a very direct connection to this work. Yemen, as the largest recipient of that US wheat food aid donations, given the particularly acute food insecurity situation, in market year 2019-20, the food aid to Yemen was roughly 563,000 metric tons. And for our current market year, 2020 to 2021, to date, that food aid has been 336,500 metric tons, which does not account for USDA tendering for a little over 51,000 metric tons of soft white wheat donation for Yemen, because the results of that tender were intended to be published today. So the focus on how Oregon and US farmers contribute to feeding the world, I think, will only increase over the next few years, given the anticipation that that food security situation will grow more dire with that accumulation of impacts from natural disasters, conflicts, and economic factors. Layered on those existing difficulties are the challenges brought forth from the pandemic, which has really further exacerbated the global hunger concerns. So I note that while international food aid takes up a significant portion of the conversation that we have, given the volume of Oregon wheat that is exported, we also directly support addressing hunger on a local level. So contributions through our Bushels for Betsy program allows us to partner with the nonprofit Farmers Ending Hunger to turn donations from our wheat growers into pancake and other baking mixes for distribution to food banks. So similar to the international front, though, we see economic strains increasing the demand and need locally, and in recognition of those extraordinary challenges that are being faced by Oregonians, the Oregon Wheat Foundation increased our contribution to Farmers Ending Hunger this year. That donation was
So audience, bear with us just a minute. Amanda's internet is coming in and out. We knew this might be a challenge. Amanda, if you can hear me, your audio is cutting in and out.
Okay. If we have to end. All right. So I'm glad to be back on. I am in rural space, and with rural spaces, these plants take up a whole lot of bandwidth, but we still do have those issues to deal with. So in relation to our domestic connection, we have increased our contributions there with generosity from our producers. I would say it will be a tough year for our wheat producers this year. We made it through the beginning of the pandemic as a reliable supplier of high quality wheat for our international markets. We'll maintain that status, but prolonged dry conditions in the state and drought are really exceptionally challenging this year and will heavily impact our producers and their wheat yields. But would say that despite those difficulties that our own producers face this year, which will be tremendous, the overall food insecurity issue on both domestic and international levels will continue to highlight the important role of wheat, and particularly Oregon wheat, as a partner in addressing hunger, and the importance of ensuring healthy wheat farms and productions throughout the state. I'll turn it over at this point to Jeremy to talk further on the next slide.
Thanks, Amanda, and it's good to be with everybody. I first want to commend all of you who are chiming in from Oregon. So much of what we have learned on how to address domestic hunger has been innovated in your state. And so for example, the summer Ebt program, essentially a program where we put extra resources on a SNAP card or on a WIC card for children when they're out of school, has been piloted over much of the past decade, and it has proven to be an incredibly successful intervention, and likely will have the most impact on addressing summer hunger that we've ever seen in our nation's history. And that program has been expanded. Now we call it Pandemic EBT, of course, during the pandemic, but we're very optimistic that that summer EBT will become a national model around the country. And that's a program that Oregonians have taken lead on, and so we are grateful for your innovation in that space. Our organization does a lot with building organizing strategies on the local community level, and much of what you did by developing food policy councils under the leadership of then Mark Winnie. As a state, you really led the nation in trying to increase access of local food production, whether that be through restaurants or directly to people who are food insecure. And it's a wonderful model that we've been able to take and adapt for people who are food insecure. Another thing is that the Oregon Food Bank was really one of the leaders in the country to try to figure out how to get fresh food to families who needed it the most. And so your farmers, many of whom that Amanda gets to work with on a daily basis, and groups like the Oregon Food Bank and your food pantries around the state, really piloted a model that now we're seeing more readily available around the country. And so thank you for that. And of course, the Murdoch Trust, who continually invests in innovation in the Northwest region, which is why, in part, you all are developing so many great things that we are able to replicate around the country. Well, again, my name is Jeremy Everett, and I am the executive director of the Baylor Collaborative at Baylor University, and we work on hunger and poverty really in three ways. So research, public service and innovation, and then in public policy. What that looks like is that we believe that, just like Brian Stevenson says, you can't solve a social problem from a distance, you have to have proximity to the problem. We have field offices around the state of Texas that are testing out new and innovative ways to address hunger and reduce poverty in their communities. And they work with our research team. We have about 60 researchers that work with us from a number of different disciplines, half of whom are faculty members at Baylor University, and then half are faculty members at other universities or research institutes around the country. What they're doing is evaluating the different models that we implement to see what can be replicated. So what are we trying out in Lubbock that might work in Dallas or even Des Moines? And we're doing that on a daily basis. And all that translates into our policy work. Now, we're not an advocacy organization, we're a university, but we do spend a good bit of time with people like Rebecca and fellow Washingtonians, working with Congress, working with USDA and our other federal agencies to try to strengthen the delivery and access of affordable, healthy food for families who are in low-income households around the country and even around the world. I'll give you one example of that, and then we can open it up for our Q&A portion. I had a privilege in 2015 of being appointed by Congress to serve on the National Commission on Hunger. It was a 10-member bipartisan commission, and our job was to identify what the root causes of food insecurity were around the country, and then to see what innovative solutions we could develop or enhance that were working to address hunger in a comprehensive way. One of the things that we found in our travels across the country, we would go sit down with low-income families and hear their stories of food insecurity, which is the technical definition for hunger that we use in the US, which means that families don't have enough food to have an active, healthy lifestyle, essentially. So they are either having to miss meals on a regular basis. In many cases, they're having to stretch their food budget. Maybe the parents won't eat so that the kids can't eat. Or maybe they'll eat highly processed foods that are oftentimes cheap and can get them to the end of a pay period. But what we found when sitting down with these families and visiting with organizations that were addressing food security issues is that what was working to address hunger in our urban communities wasn't translating to our rural communities. So, for example, when children would get out of school in the summer months in urban areas, they might be able to access a summer meal congregate program where they could physically go to a school or to a nonprofit organization or a congregation and eat on site with other children who are also participating in a summer meal program. Fortunately, we've been able to demonstrate that there are other models like the summer Ebt program where you put extra resources on a SNAP card so that families can go to the grocery store and be able to purchase food for themselves, which is incredibly helpful given that many kids aren't going to be able to go physically to a congregate meal site on a regular basis. I'll illustrate that for you in Texas. When we kicked off our work in 2009 as a collaborative, we had 2,500 summer meal sites. Over the past decade, our team has worked with the state agency who administers that program, the Texas Department of Agriculture, and we now have 6,000 summer meal sites. But we only went from participation rates from 8% to about 16% of kids that were eligible for the program because Texas is large and remote, and we have a large rural population, just like you do in Oregon. And so the problem is that with the summer Ebt program, it didn't meet the needs of kids in rural Texas and in rural America because they didn't have grocery stores where they could spend the funds. So the congregate meal program wasn't working for them. The SEBT program wasn't working for them, even though those two coupled together will have the greatest amount of impact nationwide. And so we decided that we would partner with USDA to mail boxes of food to children in 20 different school districts in East and West Texas to 4,000 kids over a 10-week demonstration period. So we tried that out in the summer of 2019, and it worked incredibly well. Now, everything we do, we build public and private partnerships to do it because our organization, our philosophy is that we don't believe that any one organization or any one sector can end hunger or poverty by themselves, that they're so large that they inherently require multi-sectoral collaboration. And so we recruited a company called McLean Global, a food distribution company, to come alongside us and USPS and UPS so that we could make boxes of food, a week's worth of food, package it to meet summer food service guidelines, and use traditional shipping sources to mail it directly to the front porches of those kids in East and West Texas. Now, one of the reasons that we chose to use traditional shipping sources is we wanted to see if it could work. And we wanted to have the lightest environmental footprint that we possibly could have. And these trucks were going up and down these roads on a daily basis anyway. So if we could load them up with food for families that needed it the most, then we felt like that was a win-win. Well, after that first summer, the program worked well. We ended up serving about 500,000 meals and snacks to children during that 10-week distribution period. So USDA came back to us at the behest of Congress and said, can you expand the program in summer of 2020 to include New Mexico and Alaska? Of course, we were eager to oblige, though Alaska presents a level of challenges that make Texas seem almost too easy by comparison. But when the pandemic hit and school districts all across the country began to close, USDA called us back and asked us if we could scale the program nationwide immediately. Well, everything that we build to scale. That's a part of our mission at the collaborative, being a part of a university, that we're looking for scalable solutions to end hunger and poverty. And so that's what we did. We ended up scaling the program into 43 states plus Puerto Rico. and served about 40 million meals to 300,000 kids over the course of last summer and early last spring after school shut down. So that's the kind of work that we do as an organization. We're typically testing out about a dozen different interventions while also trying to drive change through our hunger-free community model, which I'll tell you more about in a little bit. But that's the work that we do, and we're fortunate to get to do it, and we're fortunate to get to work with a lot of great organizations like these that are represented here today to be able to hopefully end hunger in our lifetime. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy. This is Tim DeRoche, the Director of Programs for World Oregon. I want to invite all of our panelists back to be on screen. We're going to dive into a little bit of Q&A. If you have questions for the panelists, you can put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen, depending on what your Zoom screen looks like. So, you know, the initial idea of this program was this question of how do we balance the needs of dire global humanitarian crises and feeding a population at home? And this came up the other day in discussion that the international and the domestic are not either ors. And I'm wondering if all three of you, and feel free to jump in any way you want, how do you address this, and what kind of strategies do you use in terms of public education? Because I think that, I mean, we've gone through a number of years of, you know, this America First type of policy, and this idea that if we're doing something out there in the world, it's taking away from something here at home. So I'm curious how you know, what strategies do you use to make those connections between food insecurity, food production, and broader national security?
So I'll jump in on that one. I love that you framed it as an and, because that's how we need to think about it and how we need to talk about it when we're talking to our colleagues in our communities and also with policymakers. I mean, for one thing, there's plenty of food to go around. You know, we are lucky to live in a country that has such an abundance of food, more than enough for the folks that live here, and still plenty to share with those who need it around the world. So there's that opportunity that we have by being the country that we are. There's also, you know, the moral aspect of it. You know, if you have a lot, you're considered compelled to share it, and I think that goes back to the earliest traditions that I mentioned in my opening comments. There also, I mean, there's an economic benefit to doing this, not just through the commodity purchase programs that benefit the World Food Program and other programs, but just generally, as far as, you know, having stability in countries around the world that without World Food Program assistance might not have that stability. You see food crises sort of unfold over time, and that's something, if we can get ahead of it and provide food assistance and keep a country from tipping into conflict, that's definitely in our interest, both economically and also from a national security perspective. So it's sort of threefold of why it's in our interest beyond just doing the right thing. And then on the home front, again, we've got plenty of resources to do that. We know how to do that. And in both cases, the US government plays a tremendous role just on the scale that it can provide, not that it is instead of what individuals or organizations can do on the private sector side of things, but in addition, again, another and there. So Jeremy and Amanda, I'd love to hear what you have to say on this too.
Go ahead, Amanda. Why don't you jump in?
Right. Well, I do appreciate that you're using the word and, Rebecca, because we definitely agree and look at it as an and. I think the response I would take is a little bit different track in how we approach it, because we're looking at, you know, what we're doing on the production side. So how our producers each assess themselves a portion of per bushel assessment, and most of that resource is used for our investment into research and development, and that allows us to continue to increase our production and yields while reducing the level of inputs that are required for that production. So for our perspective, it leaves us with a crop that is available for export and for supporting humanitarian aid in areas of the world that are facing those extreme challenges and lack of access to product, So we have both the domestic and the international, with a pretty heavy focus onto the international, given what we have available for export.
Yeah, and I would say, looking practically at the migration situation that we have on our southern border, as a way to kind of picture how all of this is inextricably intertwined. So, oftentimes our policies and our work as a nation in addressing the migration crisis typically begins once people get to the U.S. border. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. When you think about push factors, reasons or causes for people to actually want to come here. Now, in the past, our system is really built for the agricultural worker, the single male or female migrating into the U.S., the adult who's coming here for work. Oftentimes, so one of the reasons that we see a huge increase in migration right now at this time of year, this is when our agricultural workers come back. They go home in late October, and they're home in their home country typically for about 4 or 5 months, and then they start to come back, which has a tendency to flood our immigration system at this time of year every year. So this new big flood of undocumented immigrants on our border is pretty predictable. We act sometimes, like in the media, our policymakers act like it's a surprise every year, but if you just look on an annual basis, this is a predictable amount of individuals. What's unpredictable is the amount of children, mothers with young children, and children coming by themselves. And so why are they doing that? Well, because what's happening in their home country is, you've got high poverty rates. You don't have a rule of law that is adhered to in such a way where you have widespread gang violence. And so people, children in particular, are afraid to be, their families are afraid for their children to be, recruited and forced into gang violence. And so they feel like it's safer for them to chance it and try to make it to the U.S. For essentially safety. Also, climate change. Climate change has hit Guatemala incredibly hard. Mayan farm workers who've been farming in the hills of Guatemala and the mountains in Guatemala for thousands of years, their farms are literally eroding into the ocean. Honduras was hit by 2 Category 5 hurricanes recently, and so we're seeing this mass migration due to a number of hardships in the Northern Triangle. Well, if you begin to take an approach where we're focusing on what's happening there in the nation, if we begin to recognize that it's in our inherent best interest to ensure that there is economic well-being, that there is a strong security system in those countries, that we work with them to address climate change, just like we need to do that here at home. If we begin to work with them and partner with great organizations like the World Food Program, who are doing a lot there already, then we can begin to strengthen the nation state so that families can feel like it's safe and they can have economic well-being to be able to stay at home with their family and their friends and their communities, just like we like to do here in the US. So you can typically tell the health and well-being of a society based upon the prevalence and the severity of hunger, whether that's in the United States or in Yemen or in Guatemala. And so those are the things that I feel like are important for us to take into account when we're thinking about how do we ultimately solve some of these big social issues. We're oftentimes trying to solve them on the wrong level. And so that's one thing I would encourage us to do.
Jeremy, I'm really glad that you brought up climate change, because I was going to ask a couple questions about that. And it really makes me wonder, Amanda, both from the grower's perspective, but Rebecca from the distribution stance, how are you scenario planning around climate change and looking at shifting food sources in terms of both maintaining farms and production, but also in getting food to people?
Well, in terms of the wheat production side, so we're a little bit lucky that this is a pretty hardy plant. So it has a very wide range in what it can adapt to across a wide variety of climatic conditions. The most challenging areas that we have for production are those lowest rainfall areas. The moisture content is really the driving factor for what we're able to produce in those regions. So we have an investment, federal investment into our ag research stations out in Pendleton, Oregon, a significant investment there for the resilient dryland farming appropriation. And those research plots, which have been very long-term out there, I think 1930s was the establishment of some of those earliest long-term plots, allows us to look over time at what's happening and to invest into the research to help our producers adapt. We're continually putting in our research dollars to variety development that will allow us to be most suited to the region in which our wheat is grown. So it's, for us, you know, research is a primary infrastructure piece in reality, because it's what allows us to continue to adapt to all of our changing environments over time.
I'll just jump in. You know, really three things that I'll mention around it. First of all is with the increase in extreme weather events. Obviously, that's increasing the demand on the emergency response. You know, that sort of typical, you know, drought or typhoon or natural disaster that you think of the World Food Program responding to. Secondly, you know, from the logistics standpoint, I mentioned the tremendous transportation and logistics network that the World Food Program has access to globally. And, you know, they've really done an amazing job of adapting to, you know, things that change. For instance, the rainy season in Sudan. I mean, there literally are weeks, months of the year where you can't get anywhere on roads. You have to use airdrops. And so they've been able to adapt, but at the same time, an airdrop is much more expensive than a convoy. So if you're thinking about limited resources and reaching the maximum number of people possible, that is a challenge. Finally, I would just say, you know, on the flip side, the World Food Program on its own, and also working with some of its partners, is really thinking about climate resilience techniques and opportunities for the folks that they work with. So if you're a smallholder farmer, you know, working with those folks to do crop diversification or look at, you know, strains that may be more drought resistant or rain tolerant, depending on what the extreme that you're facing in the environment is. So it's not just responding to the increasing challenges that are coming from extreme weather events and climate change, but also, you know, trying to help folks adapt at the very local level as well.
You know, and we were talking the other day about this, some of the challenges for small farms. And Amanda, you brought up the question of freight. And when we look at issues around freight and critical infrastructure, I would assume that from the farming stance, there's a challenge there, but also in the distribution stance for the World Food Program, you're looking at some of those other additional challenges. And I'm wondering if you can kind of dive into that a little bit. Either one of you.
I'll just say, I mean, the main thing from a freight perspective is just, you know, the freight cost is something that we don't control, but does ultimately, if you've got a fixed amount of money available to get food somewhere and you're paying more for freight, then you have less to use to buy the item that you're trying to get to folks who need it. So that's just, in a very simple answer, the main impact that affects the World Food Program's operations.
And for us, yeah, it impacts all of our transportation pieces. A lot of the conversation around freight has been about the container shortages. No doubt that is an issue for the nation. It's not something on, you know, container pieces that would hinder grain trade, given how our grain is transported. It does impact parts and other products, and those are, you know, issues that our farmers face in terms of backlogs on orders. What we do face is really tight logistics, and we've been consistently monitoring the status of our transportation infrastructure. The 6 Portland export area facilities are exporting about 45% of U.S. wheat and about 25% of all U.S. grains. So when we look at ocean freight really being backed up the last few months and seeing a significant amount of other grains, other commodities moving through those export facilities, particularly corn and soybeans out of the Pacific Northwest, that's contributing to our tight logistics. It equates to more cost for getting to destination. That freight is a really significant purchasing factor when we're dealing with raw commodities. So when I looked at our last price report, kind of to give a sample of what's happening there, a sample ocean freight rate estimate this time last year from the Pacific Northwest to Japan was about $21 per metric ton. And in our current time frame, it's about $37 per metric ton. So it's been increasing pretty dramatically. And that, as Rebecca notes, when we talk about humanitarian aid, those transportation costs just relate to fewer commodities that we can purchase and move over there.
So a question for you about large agricultural exports. Do large agricultural exports of commodities from the US or the EU or Brazil, do they hurt subsistence farmers in developing countries? Sort of like, sending US corn to Mexico.
I don't mean to keep answering all of them first, but I think that one's pretty much in my wheelhouse. So that's one of the great things about the local and regional purchase program and the cash-based transfers that the World Food Program uses. If there is an existing market and there are existing commodities at the local level, the last thing anybody wants to do is come in and flood the market with outside commodities, because then it drives down the price and you're just exacerbating the problem you're trying to address. And so where commodities are available at the local level, cash is used by the World Food Program to purchase those. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, that isn't always possible, either for specific items or just because of conflict or lack of markets, there's nothing there. And so that's where the ability to tap into the great commodities network of the United States and the others you mentioned comes in quite handy. You do get a delay in the delivery time, and that's sometimes a bit of a challenge as well. Obviously, if you're buying something locally and it's available, you can get it right then. If you have to have something shipped in, there's a time factor, and if there's a limitation on what ships are available or what freight capabilities are available, that is limiting as well. But where possible, buy local or regional, but where it's not possible, really grateful to have the network that the World Food Program has access to for commodities.
So question directly for Jeremy. This is from Joy Bailey, who works with Lutheran Community Services in Northwest. She asks, because poverty and food insecurity have been closely linked to co-occurring trauma, i.e. unaddressed mental health issues, adverse childhood experience, exposure to violence, how is the Baylor Collective integrating trauma-informed approaches and collaborating with other social service organizations to more effectively and holistically address the issue of generational trauma, poverty, and food insecurity?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and it's a well-informed question. So, Joy, kudos to you and your work. I can tell that you all must be doing some incredible work there in your community. I'll say a couple things. First of all, I think it's important to understand why we have food insecurity in the U.S., and it is most often directly tied to financial insecurity or economic insecurity. Typically, hunger in the U.S. is episodic. So it's unlike the hunger that the World Food Program is addressing, where the severity is literally, we have, unfortunately, so many people dying on a regular basis in a world where we actually produce enough food. In the U.S., hunger is typically episodic, so people oftentimes experience it at the end of a pay period. The primary cause of food insecurity in the U.S. is underemployment, meaning that people are working, but they're not making enough money to make ends meet. So in Texas, for example, we still operate with the federal minimum wage. So even if you're able to put together 40 hours worth of work, 52 weeks a year, you're still only bringing in about $15,000 a year before taxes. Well, that's not even enough to pay for rent in most communities, much less any of your other expenses like childcare expenses, rent, medication, transportation costs, and so forth. And so that has a direct implication on your ability to purchase food. Coupled with that, you have what's called income volatility. It's not something that we talk about very often, but it's something that has traumatic effect on families who are living with such a tight budget. And so many of us have worked an hourly wage paying job before in the past. And essentially, when you're working an hourly wage paying job, you rarely get to choose the shift that you're going to work or dictate how many hours a week of work you're going to get. And so from week to week, you really don't know how many hours you're going to get in a given, in a given week or a given month. So one week you might work mornings and get 15 hours a week. The next week it might be afternoons and you get 20 hours a week. The following week it might be evenings and you get 10 hours a week. But that sets up a situation where you have income volatility, meaning that from week to week, you don't know how much money you're going to make. Well, you add in a pandemic where we have been closed periodically. Your company or your business or your restaurant might be open at 25% capacity or might not be open at all. Then it might be open at 100% capacity only to have a big spread in your community and it revert back to 25% capacity. And so income volatility during the pandemic has been off the charts. So we saw food insecurity rates rise from 11.1% prior to the pandemic, which was a historic low in modern American history, to 23%, which is the highest on record in modern American history nationwide. And we know that that's because families who are already living with stretched budgets were dealing with difficult circumstances. And I want to give one illustration of this, and then we can certainly move on. But so I mentioned proximity. So for 20 years, I lived and worked in low-income neighborhoods so that I could see what was happening in communities from the inside out. A neighbor that I had in San Antonio was a woman named Lupe. The neighborhood we lived in had about 150,000 residents, and our best high school had a 50% dropout rate in the community. The median income was $19,000 per household, and typically you had 3 generations sharing a home. So a family that lived in between our house and Lupe's house had over 20 people living in a small 2-bedroom home, roughly with the median income of $19,000 for all those people to share. Well, Lupe and her husband were devout Catholics. They had 8 children. Her husband was the only person on our block that had full-time employment with one employer. And so he would leave every day and go off to work. Lupe would send her 8 children off to school. And then she would take her 2 wheelchair-bound parents who also lived with her and get them situated at the senior center before she'd make her way to the schools to volunteer in the community. She was kind of the patron saint of education because she knew the ticket out of poverty for her kids and the kids in the neighborhood was to graduate from high school and hopefully go to San Antonio Community College. Well, Lupe got an ear infection like we've all gotten before, but she and most people in our community didn't have health insurance. And so she waited until it was too painful to bear. She ultimately made her way down to an emergency room in downtown San Antonio. She waited all day to be seen, but her name was not called. She knew she had to get back home to meet with her kids. But when her kids got out of school, but later that evening, her eardrum ruptured. The infection went into her brain. She fell into a coma and she never woke up. The next day, her kids were going door to door on our block with her husband, raising money for a memorial service so that they could bury their mother. Her husband came and sat on my front porch and he just buried his head in his hands and he said, "What am I going to do? What am I going to do?" The reality is in America, it's the same family bearing the weight of all of our broken social systems. They're typically, they're disproportionately people of color. They're both food insecure and they don't have health care. They're underemployed and they don't know how they're going to make ends meet on a given week, much less a given month. And so they're bearing the weight of all these different broken social systems, and they're forced to make trade-offs each month to determine what are they going to use their money to pay for. Are they going to pay for food or rent? Or medication or transportation. If they don't pay rent, they get kicked out of their home. And so oftentimes what they choose to do is they make food that trade-off. And so they just choose to eat less to get by to the next pay period. So wise observation, Joy, on your part. And I would say that what we have to do to move forward is build hunger-free community coalitions. We have to get all the organizations in your community who are working to address hunger, working in a collaborative manner strategically to identify gaps and address those gaps if we're going to end hunger in our nation, which is certainly possible.
So a question for you, Amanda. I mean, one of the initial inspirations for this program was that shipment of wheat to Yemen. And I was so moved by, I was at the press conference with Steve Anderson from the World Food Program, and I met one of the farmers that grew the wheat. And I was struck by the idea that the word globalism is still a bad word in many places, or is a misunderstood word. And I think there's a lot of tension in Oregon around free trade. You know, people like to frame free trade as, you know, killing jobs, yet, I mean, we are so trade dependent as a state. I mean, wheat is one of 250 or more crops that we ship all over the world, you know, grass seed, blueberries, Christmas trees, wheat, you name it, soybeans. So I'm curious, in the communities that are growing wheat and are very dependent on export and trade, how does this discussion of free trade filter down to the communities where things are being grown? I mean, is there discussion? Is there public education on the importance of it?
So we have a lot of discussions for Oregon wheat with, you know, about 85 to 90% of our product is exported. So that is absolutely a significant portion of what's coming out of this state is going for international destinations. And all of our trade agreements have a great deal of importance. We had a number of those that in the 2019 period, if we look at US, Mexico, Canada agreement for a broader US wheat perspective, to our bilateral with Japan, to furthering some things with China. Our major markets there all have a relationship to the arrangements that we're able to make in relationship with other countries on those trade agreements. So from an Oregon wheat perspective, and as we work with our commission and our board, the trade perspective and developing our markets is a primary element of the work that we are doing, not just with our existing customers, but also in developing new markets as well for our product. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of the response that you're looking for. I'm not certain if I hit on all of the things that you're hoping to hit there.
So this last year has been an unbelievable perfect storm on so many levels. We have COVID, we've had the forest fires here in the state. When we look at, climate change, forest fires, natural disaster, state, fed, and foreign policy, what are the biggest factors affecting the ability of wheat farmers to thrive, but also to be able to deliver things out into the world right now? And then I want to circle back around and talk a little bit about public will, because we're getting up towards the end of the hour. But Tom Colicchio was really, really good on this of how do we build will. And, Lester Brown, who we had speak a number of years ago, talked about full planet, empty plates. We have the capacity to do it, but what are the things, what are the challenges in front of us, and how does an ordinary citizen become more involved and make their voice heard?
So I think when I went through my presentation, I talked about there's a huge level of risk and factors that are outside of the control of our producers. Demand and supply side. On the supply side, in this particular year, one of the major challenges that we're facing is just the dry conditions, the prolonged period of those dry conditions, as that contributes to what will be our actual crop production for 2021. That is a major factor that is weighing very heavily on the minds of all of our Oregon wheat producers as they come into this year. Prices for wheat have been going up, but as have the inputs. So we're looking at a challenging period of, potentially lower production, well, and certainly lower production this year than we were last year. And then as we look forward into the next year, those inputs rising again. So there's a lot that we, have to do in terms of supports to ensure that we keep our farms healthy and our producers able to manage those cycles and that risk year over year. That's the primary piece that I think will be in front of us in the next year, and then we'll be coming up into policy-related pieces as we look at upcoming Farm Bill and other programs that have direct impact to our producers.
Great. And then on the question of will, Kalikio also brought up this question of food waste, that there is need, but yet we have all of this food going to waste. What are 2 or 3 things that an ordinary citizen can do to become more aware, become more involved, make these connections between the domestic and the global? And we like when people come out of one of these programs not feeling small by the enormity of the issue, but having a few places that they can go to know more, learn more, and be involved.
So I'm going to use the typical DC approach of acknowledging your question, but then answering with something else. So, I love the food waste issue because it's really good for getting folks engaged in a conversation about hunger, both on the domestic and the international front. And I'm a huge fan of Tom and the work that he's doing to draw attention to this, particularly in the US side of things. But, telling my son if he doesn't eat his peas, there's starving children somewhere, that's not going to solve the problem at its heart. We all certainly need to be mindful about what we're consuming and hopefully minimizing waste as much as possible. The World Food Program is doing some great work in the field with smallholder farmers on post-harvest loss, some innovative hermetic storage to deal with aflatoxin and other diseases that can affect the usability of food once it's produced. But really, this comes down to what my good friend and mentor, David Beckman, calls collective give a damn. And that's really taking the time to talk about the issues of hunger, both in the US and across the world, with your friends, your families, your colleagues, and your elected officials. And, letting them know this is something that matters, that this is something that you want your representatives and senators to, take into consideration when they're considering things like the Farm Bill or the annual appropriations process. The World Food Program is 100% funded by voluntary contributions, and that's from governments, corporations, individuals. So that support is really critical. And lending your voice is such an important thing, and also thinking of bringing unlikely suspects into that conversation with you. Is there a faith leader in your community who might be interested in talking about this with you? Feeding people is a tradition that transcends really all faith traditions. And so it's a great unifying factor there. Are there folks in the private sector in your community that are interested in this that you can bring in? Is there somebody from the local food bank that also cares about global hunger, and you can go talk about these things together? I would say if you're looking for information on the issue of global hunger and some of the specific issues, I have to pitch wfpusa.org, our website, and also our social media channels is a great way just to find information and find ways to get involved. That your voice is so powerful in what it can bring to attention. I think sometimes folks think these are issues that have persisted for so long that we'll always have hunger. But I'll tell you a story. I think Jeremy's probably heard it. When I entered into the anti-hunger space about a decade ago, my daughter was a young elementary school student at the time, and I was telling her what I was going to go do. And she said, well, so Mom, you're working to help build the public and political will to end hunger. And I said, yep. And she said, well, Mom, if you do that, you're not going to have a job anymore. And all I could think was, we all need the optimism of that 8-year-old to say, we shouldn't take for a given that people have to be hungry. We should think about how we can address that, both the immediate needs of people who are hungry now, and then also how we can help folks provide for themselves long-term.
That's I echo Rebecca's sentiment. We have an organization here locally that has a tagline, "We're doing the most good." And it always cracks me up, that they would have the audacity to put that on their sign, that we're doing the most good. I can say this because I don't work for the World Food Program. I think they're doing the most good. So so whatever Rebecca says and her colleagues at the World Food Program, I just want to give them a high five and say do whatever she says. And Amanda, I love that you're representing farmers. We have a small farm here, and farmers are the unsung hero of our fight to end hunger. We couldn't do it without their efforts, without them continually keeping us well fed and clothed and you name it. So thank you for letting me be on this panel with you, and Tim for your facilitation. I'll give you this illustration. So William Wilberforce was the 18th century British parliamentarian who was credited for ending the British slave trade. And he worked his entire life to end the British slave trade. And he built the most unlikely alliance of characters to be able to help him achieve that cause that British Parliament had probably ever seen before or since. But he achieved that goal 3 days before he died. He literally gave his life to the cause. But one of his biographers noted that probably wasn't his greatest accomplishment, that his greatest accomplishment was ending the very idea that slavery was an acceptable form of commerce. Because until that point throughout all human history, that was just how you made money. That's just how you did business. And so I think if we are going to end hunger, if we're going to end hunger as a society, if we're going to end poverty as a society, we have to decide that hunger is no longer an acceptable social condition. Because right now it's virtually tolerable. We allow for food insecurity to be rampant in our communities, in our states, and around the world. If we decided that people actually did have a right to food, that recognizing that we produce enough for everybody in the world to have access to adequate, healthy food, essentially 3 healthy meals a day, 7 days a week, no matter where they lived. And we determined that we were going to end hunger and that it was no longer socially acceptable, we would do it. Our policies would change, our procedures would change, how we set up our communities on the local level would change, where we put grocery stores would change. And so ultimately, that is what we're going to have to achieve as a society. I think to work towards that, building hunger-free communities is the ticket on the local level. Building these local coalitions, in my opinion, it is 21st century nonviolent social change. And it is where you can begin to really build the collective will and drive change on the local level to end hunger, while pointing to larger systemic issues, whether that be structural racism, criminal justice issues, climate change and extreme weather and its effects on poverty and food access, as well as access to healthcare and things. All of these things are inextricably intertwined. But building that hunger-free community coalition in your community is something you can do. You can go to our website, hungerandpoverty.org. You can click on our hunger-free community toolkit and learn how to do it. It's something that Rebecca and I put together with our teams years ago. It's something that we wholeheartedly endorse. But if you do that, then you will end hunger in your community. I can assure you of it. It won't be easy because addressing these big justice issues is never easy, but it's definitely doable.
Jeremy, thank you so much. Rebecca, thank you for your contributions. Amanda, I'm so glad you could join us. I'm going to bring Derek back on to take us out into this glorious day that we are having here in Portland. And I want to thank everyone for joining us and for some good questions.
So just seconding Tim, and a shout out to the World Affairs Councils of America, the World Food Program USA, and MJ Murdoch Charitable Trust for making today's event possible, as well as the Oregon Wheat Commission and Baylor Collaborative on Hunger and Poverty. The links for all of those organizations are in the chat for you to follow up with. And we will have also a note, the link to the Oregon Food Bank, which is a partner organization that we've had many international visitors, youth and adult, who have partnered when they've come here through State Department exchange programs with the Oregon Food Bank and local pantries. Looking forward to seeing you at our next programs coming up. We have ones on US strategy, on China, on urban planning in England. Take a look at our website. We'll see you at the next event. Thanks all. Be safe, be healthy, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thanks again.